Unthinkable. In 2009, Patrick Lagardère, one of the great conceptualists of risk management, wrote a paper called Unthinkable Events in Inconceivable Contexts. And it is, how do we prepare ourselves for something which is beyond our thinking? And we are genuinely in beyond our thinking. This is almost impossible to conceive of the situations that we're in right now. Um, you talk about community resilience, but to a large extent, resilience is just about getting stuff right. You mentioned that in New York, in the hospitals, the emergency generating systems are in the basement. It's the same in London. In London, our number one environmental risk is flooding. And in hospitals, most of those hospitals have their emergency generating system in the basement. I was speaking to Matt Hogan, who, of course, Toby Harris knows very, very well from London Resilience. We were working together with Matt in 2013 on the London Resilience Gold Command project. It was identified then that pretty well every hospital in London had its emergency generating system in the basement. And 15 years later, that is still the case. Well, if that is still the case, you can't talk about resilience if you don't get that right. You have to get that bit right. Let's go back to this idea then of community resilience. Toby, let me bring you in. Because James Arbuthnot, who we both know very well, wrote the report on the UK's preparedness and identified community resilience as being a significant part of that. But to come back to Ebru's point on equity, and this was a point brought up really strongly in the program yesterday about Finland's resilience. If you want to get fit, it helps to be healthy. If you're not healthy, it's difficult to get fit. If you want to have community resilience, you've got to have a healthy community, don't you? A healthy nation. And I don't think in the UK we do have a healthy nation. I think there is polarization, there is disempowerment, there are whole communities who feel disempowered. We see funding being taken away from critical services. If we're going to make a difference, Toby, to actually make a difference, how can we build in a community resilience that allows us to do that? Because I think the idea, I'm sure the famous Ronald Reagan phrase, the most dangerous phrase in the English language is, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. I think we are losing our belief that the government is actually going to turn up and help us, which is a very wide-ranging comment from my part. Any thoughts on that, Toby? How do we create that community resilience?
Actually, I think it might be the other way round, that there are an awful lot of communities, particularly in urban areas, who just assume they, unspecified, will come and deal with this. I have no responsibility. And there is an issue about what degree of responsibility individual households should take upon themselves. And if you look at Finland, if you look at Sweden, if you look at the guidance that's issued in quite a number of countries about what you should have in your own home in terms of emergency supplies, then the Swedish booklet, If Crisis or War Comes, there's a checklist of things that you should do. So there is a little bit about, I don't want to turn everybody into manic preppers, but you do need to accept that there is some individual responsibility. And I think there's a complacency. I see it in cities. I think it's less true in rural areas where people just assume the authorities will come and sort this out. I don't need to do anything. In fact, the sensible thing for me to do is to carry on as before and keep flushing the toilets or whatever it might be, which is not necessarily helpful. So I think there's a bit about preparing the public generally for what their role is and what they need to do. But I think the other aspect of it is that all crises end up being local crises, so that the events that happen will impact at a local level. So how do you ensure that at local level you're able to respond? And the reality may well be that it will take some time for the authorities to arrive there. So the immediate help is going to come from neighbours. Now, neighbourhood structures are breaking down. We no longer necessarily identify with a neighbourhood. We identify with an online community. And that is something which is changing over time. But one of the things that the National Preparedness Commission is looking at in the UK, and we're just starting a program of work, which is looking about the role of faith communities, which is not necessarily about that single faith, but about what they see as their responsibility to the communities around them. And it's making sure that those networks are resilient. We did another piece of work which looked at how local communities responded during COVID, and where there was some existing infrastructure of local groups and so on, they were able to step up and provide additional support to people. But over the last 20 plus years, the funding available for those local groups has diminished, and it becomes much more difficult. So I think if you were building a national preparedness or a national resilience plan, you would also be wanting to look at what are the local structures and how can we reinforce those local structures, making use of what's there already, which might be faith communities, it might be arranged around particular localities, or it may be arranged around particular interest groups. So I think that's part of the way you would need to approach these things.
It's interesting, Toby, because it's 2005, after Hurricane Katrina, where FEMA failed miserably, they did a review of themselves, and they came back and they said, we made a mistake. We actually had a fundamental mistake in our doctrine. We thought our job as FEMA was to do crisis management. It's not. Our job is to support communities that do crisis management. We don't fly in and do crisis management. We support that. We were involved again in London Resilience in 2013, and I think one of the most significant decisions made was to include the faith groups, because it gives you immediate connectivity into the neighborhoods. I can't remember the figure, but in my mind it's 270 meters. I don't know why it is, but in my mind in London, you cannot be more than 270 meters from a place of worship. It's there's going to be somewhere, and of course that gets you into your neighborhood and gets those resources there. We said, and I think you were involved in those conversations right at the beginning of COVID in our global crisis work programs, that the role of the government was going to be to support. COVID was going to be community managed. If we're going to go into a lockdown, it is the communities are going to have ownership of that. That never happened, of course. That was never supported. So we'll loop around. Ian, I see you've got your hand up. I'm going to come to Ebru first, and then I'm going to bring you in, Ian. And then anybody else who'd like to contribute to the conversation, please feel free to do so. Ebru, let's bring you in and have a thoughts, because communities, you brought up the subject of community. Do you feel that, as Toby says, we're breaking our communities apart, or is that actually an asset and a resource which is still available to us?
I think they are an immense resource, and it should be. Toby, I fully agree with Toby that the heart of resilience is community resilience, because everything happens at the community level, and faith-based and other civil society organizations or community organizations have an immense role, or can have an immense role in bringing together the community, increasing social capacity, what we call social resilience. And as I was listening, I know that working at different at the global level, know that there are examples, for instance, in the Philippines, in Japan, on integrating these community level organizations into the decision making system in a way that the structure, in a way, it's a little bit more formalized, so that communities have a say from early on into making decisions on resilience. In Japan, I think it's called bokomis. They have in each community they have this. I think it was formed after. In a way, it came together after the Kobe earthquake, the year of volunteer organizations, and Spokom is formed of elderly populations in communities. They have there is a system in a way that they can bring their information or bring their decisions, work together in monthly meetings, bring their information into the resilience system. In terms of so we see these structures, as I just mentioned, in some countries. At the same time, as I was mentioning, we are currently working in Barcelona, in the old town of Barcelona. And we realized, we've been doing interviews with communities there. We realized that that community was the immigrant community, was in a way that old historical town of Barcelona, what's called Ciutat Vella, was. There is a lot of work going on in Barcelona in terms of urban resilience. As you know, it is famous for urban resilience, the super blocks, the green corridors, etc. But there has not been focus on the historical part, and it's kind of neglected. And we realized doing our interviews there is a strong social there is a strong social bond in the communities there. It's Pakistani communities, Chinese communities, immigrant population. And since that these neighborhoods are neglected, they have found way to bring their communities up. They are buying apartments together in a joint way, families coming up together instead of renting, getting out of these like formal systems to be able to kind of not break the system, but they have found ways to form these like strong bonds to be able to make a living and increase their. They have adapted. They have increased their own resilience. So that was very, very interesting for us because we really realized there is so much money coming from the European Union to Barcelona, and there is so much funding on urban resilience. And we're just trying to find the answer that why none of these projects are being implemented in the historical time. Why are these buildings so dilapidated? And it's interesting. We are like, our students are working on developing proposals, but again, going back to the question, I mean, social capacity, social resilience, I think is the key. And I don't know if we are, as you asked the question, if we are breaking our communities, if we are. I don't know the answer to that. I think like it is very different from context to context. But some communities are strong together. Perhaps the cohesion is not there in other communities. So I think it's very contextual.